and Gucci, Louis and Nikes.
We have Jerry Muma, who is Executive Director of Innovations Human Trafficking Collaborative, and she is based out of Olympia, Washington. She's been awarded the Office of Justice Programs Award for her work improving the lives of human trafficking survivors. She's also a consultant for the Department of Homeland Security in the Office of Victim of Crime and Office on Trafficking in Persons. She has been a consultant in many other matters, and we have worked together several times. And I really are glad that she's moderating this, because while I know a little bit about this subject, she is considered a national expert, as well as the rest of our panelists. So I'm glad she is able to moderate this. Thank you. And Jerry, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gabe, for putting this on, and for all of us together to really learn more. And I appreciate the short introduction from Gabe. I also want to share that I am a subject matter expert from lived experience. And, I really believe that any work needs to not only be led by survivors, but in a way where it is amplified beyond just your story of trauma. And so one of the programs that we have within our organization is that we have a survivor leadership academy, and really have been blessed with being able to work with survivors across the country and tribes. I'm Native American. I am an enrolled Shoshone-Bannock tribal member. We do a lot of work across the country with tribal and non-tribal about building a response. Because it's one thing to understand what trafficking is, and even to have the human trafficking hotline number, but when it happens, what is everybody's role? And how can we hold their feet to the fire? Because I can tell you this, as a direct service organization, most places do not have a good response protocol. And, often, the victims are the ones that suffer. And so I'm very passionate about that. I mean, when I hear you guys' bio, I'm like, oh my gosh, I am on here with some really amazing people. And so in Native tradition, it is a cultural way to start a meeting. I want to do a land acknowledgement. I know that we are all across the country, but I am in Olympia, Washington, and I am on Nisqually the Nisqually tribe traditional land. And I think that that's, one of the really great things about this, coming from Hawaii, and really just want to honor the Hawaiian natives that are, really going through some things around, protecting their sacred mountains and different things like that. So enough about that. I can think of 1,000 things to ask you guys, but I promise that I won't. And I also want to encourage you guys, if you have questions, throw them in the chat. We're going to have a short Q&A time at the end. But I'm going to start with Molly. And, honestly, on the I-5 corridor, being in Olympia, placed, pretty much between Portland and Seattle, I've been blessed with opportunities to work with like Mike Gallagher and, different people in the Portland area. And so I really want to ask each of you quickly, where does your passion come from? This is a hard subject. And where does your passion come from?
I've worked in corrections for almost 26 years now, and I'm moving towards working oftentimes with second generation individuals that are not just criminal justice involved, but have had negative impacts because their lives have intersected with the trauma of trafficking, whether they've been involved in family systems and indirectly involved or directly involved because they're also being exploited. I think my passion lies because I literally could have retired 3 years ago, of trying to build and continue to create systems of our collaboration versus just, even though a lot of this is reliant on our relationships with other people, we need to create systems so that people aren't falling between the cracks when individuals that are good at this work retire and leave. And one of my best friends is a survivor that I've met through this work in the last 7 years that I've been focused solely on trafficking. And I literally go to her. I mean, we talk daily, and we have to constantly check in with each other because there are times that, it becomes really hard. And we have a lot of challenges right now in the world, especially with a lot of legislative changes here in Oregon that to me are not looking at what would be best for our victims, or even listening to the victim voices from Oregon. We've got a lot of people from external groups trying to impact changes in laws. So I don't know, my hard push is just to amplify the voices of our survivors and make sure that women that are involved in the criminal justice system aren't forgotten.
Molly, you have my heart. You do, because I mean, we're like right there. And one of the things that I wanted to hit on that you talked about is people that are passionate and really good at their work, and there's no succession plan when they retire. So who's going to move up and be that champion, and not let that work die? I would love to have continued conversations with all of us and consider, how can we partner together? How can we amplify those voices and get those systems? So I appreciate your answer. And Kim, I'm going to ask you the same question. Where does your passion for this come from?
Thanks for the question. So I have a PhD in criminology from George Mason University. And while I was in undergrad and graduate school, I was fortunate enough to take some classes by one of the leading experts on this topic at the time before it became popularized, before the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed, by the name of Louise Shelley. And I think that I was first impassioned to work on this topic because I was a graduate, I think, starting out my master's program before my PhD. And I took this class, and I was shocked to have graduated undergrad and I hadn't heard the term human trafficking. And I didn't know that it was a crime. I didn't know that people were being enslaved and exploited. And I think at that moment, once I saw some raw tapes of investigations, it really just, I'm a very justice-oriented person anyway. It really just impassioned me to look into it further. In my graduate program, in criminology, though, it was a heavily quantitative program, and there were no data on human trafficking. So one of the leading data collections on crime is the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. And at the time, it didn't even have a data point on trafficking measures to even assess prevalence. So the lack of data, the horrific nature of this clandestine crime just really impassioned me to look into it further. So it wasn't until, I did some research, but I started to more actively conduct qualitative research where I conducted trauma-informed interviews with victims, convicted offenders, consenting sex workers, as well as commercial sex consumers, to really understand from a qualitative perspective what was going on, why was it happening, why was there this level of impunity enjoyed by the traffickers, why weren't they getting I guess equivalent punishments to the severity of the, and it really just kind of impassioned me to look into it further. And eventually I started serving as an expert witness, where I'm bridging the credibility gap of victims. A lot of people don't understand trafficking doesn't happen like the movie Taken, where there's this clearly innocent victim and there's these clearly, you know, gun wielding offenders who are kidnapping her. It's more coercion, deception, it's more hidden. And so the more I work in it, in this field, I think the more impassioned I become. But that initial passion was sparked by the fact that I thought I was a very well-educated young lady, yet I had never heard the term trafficking before, which was abhorrent, the fact that it was going on without that level of public awareness. So
Thank you so much for that. And did you do have a book, correct?
yes, I have a copy right here. So this is
Okay.
this is the book, Hidden in Plain Sight, America's Slaves of the New Millennium. It's separated into two larger sections, sex trafficking and then labor trafficking, but it features some of those interviews that I've conducted with convicted human traffickers. It's been reviewed by, you know, prominent people within the field, like Sandra Sparks, Executive Director of Race Child Trafficking, the former federal human trafficking prosecutor, John Cotton, the editor of the Crime Report, and as well as a number of others. So I've used this book, and some organizations use it to train law enforcement, but it's a general consumption primer on the topic to really expose the realities, how it happens, who's at risk of victimization, and what we can do about it.
Do you have a link to the book? If you have a link to the book, could you please drop that in the chat?
Sure. I mean, it's sold everywhere books are sold, but I can send like the Amazon link in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So next, if you would, I would like to hear Tika. And same question to you. You know, where does your passion come from?
Well, my passion basically comes from my pain. As a survivor of human trafficking myself, coming out of it, I wasn't sure of why I went through what I went through. It wasn't until probably about 6 years ago when I started doing some trainings on human trafficking, and I started doing some advocate work. I understood that I could use my pain as purpose, and I could show young women, especially young women, that there is life after trafficking. My trafficking ended 18 years ago, and the work that I have done on myself, I'm sure that there are a lot of young girls and a lot of young women that can be able to do the work a lot sooner and to recover from their trauma a lot sooner than I have. And then what I have found out working for an organization called Journey Out, that I could also assist law enforcement connect with survivors, as well as other service providers connect with law enforcement and connect with survivors as well. So my experiences and my purpose is what led me to having the passion to do the work that I do.
Absolutely love that. Passion from pain turned to purpose. And that is beautiful. And so thank you. All right, we are back. And, you know, I just want to say thank you for you guys' passion, your willingness to really share about that. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, and reports have came out that human trafficking is the second largest global criminal enterprise. And, you know, when we look at that, it is estimated to be a $150.2 billion a year industry. And so when we are looking at human trafficking, it makes sense. it makes sense because I mean, if you're a drug dealer, you sell the drugs once, you have to go re-up and get more drugs and sell them again. But with victims, sadly, it is a reusable commodity. And so what we are seeing is a trend of organized crime and gangs turning to human trafficking. And when we think about that, I mean, we can think of some of the motorcycle gangs that have been involved in trafficking historically. But I want to ask anybody on this panel if they could provide some insight around what they're seeing with gangs and trafficking.
Well, I'll start. I can take that. I think, and you've laid it out really pretty well. This is a relatively low risk, high profit crime for the gangs. And that in and of itself, I think probably says all you need to know, quite honestly. Anything that a gang can get involved in that is going to be high profit and low risk is good for them, bad for everybody else. And so that's one of the primary motivators, I think. And also we know that most law enforcement, and Kim certainly alluded to that earlier, we're kind of behind the curve on all this. I mean, we're behind the curve on human trafficking generally. Mm-hmm. And so now you have that sort of other layer of now we've got organized crime, we've got gangs, we've got gangsters involved in that. And how do we prosecute that? And what are the district attorneys going to be looking for if they're even willing to prosecute? And more importantly, how do we train them? How do we find that? Mm-hmm. And that becomes very difficult to work with. And some of that's organizational. For example, a law enforcement officer on a car stop, and I'm sure everybody here knows this, you know, there's pressure to get that car stop done and move on to the next call, to the next stop. And so you don't have a lot of time to look at what's happening in the car, to look at who's in the car, who's speaking for the people in the car, who's got the IDs and all of that. So you move on to the next crime. So again, it's low risk for the gangster because he's probably not going to get his stable of girls questioned or picked up. He's probably not going to get picked up. And then unfortunately, the other real reality here, and again, everybody on the panel, I think, knows this, but you've got a large group of, I don't want to say willing participants, because that would be wrong and I would get slapped, especially by my beautiful wife. But certainly, if you do lose a victim, lose a survivor, as we like to call them here in Alabama, there's somebody else waiting in the wings to be recruited, to be groomed, etc. And as I'm finding out more and more with some of my other work with men, there's also a fairly large group of individuals, mostly men, who want the service you're being provided.
Yes.
So you've got a number of people that can do the work, if you will. You've got a number of people who want to purchase the product, and it's low risk, high profit, and cops are ignorant, and I mean that in a good way. We can fix ignorance, but all of that leads to the second most profitable business for organized crime and gangs in the world.
Yes.
I just wanted to add on there. So I sent a link in the chat to actually a conviction that happened locally here of an MS-13 gang member who was involved in sex trafficking of minors. I feature that case in chapter 7 of my book. And just to kind of segue from Jeff's mention of low risk, why is it low risk? It's low risk because, again, it's not typically physical force, it's coercion and deception. They make their victims believe they're consenting participants. And to that effect, I wanted to read just a very small excerpt from the trial transcripts of that case. From the trial transcripts of that case are featured on page 77 of my book. The defense attorney asked one of the minor victims, one of the children, he said, "Is it fair to say that you didn't want to go home?" The girl says basically yes. He asks again, despite the fact that you were being prostituted by MS-13, you didn't want to go home? And she says yes. And I talk about that, and when I'm doing trainings, it is a sad testament to society when a child thinks that being sex trafficked by a gang is an improvement to her life. Her life at home was so bad that she thought being sex trafficked by a gang was a better option to this minor, to this child. That should never, ever, ever happen.
No.
But that's the reality. And when we're talking about, Jeff, very astutely mentioned over and over, low risk, it's because of things like that. Things like that, when they play out in the courtroom, an average juror might think she's a consenting participant. She wanted to be there because of that line of questioning, but they don't understand the mental manipulation. So when I talk about it, when I teach about it, I say it's a mental tether as opposed to a physical chain. They're mentally grooming them. So I just wanted to add that in to provide a little bit of color to that situation, in particular involving gangs.
Oh, thank you so much. Honestly, victims of brutal trafficking cases that, honestly, the defense is prepping them for the prosecutor's prepping them for the defense to grill them. And it's just, when you say that mental tether, oftentimes traffickers use addictive narcotic drugs as a restraint, and people don't understand that, and they think, oh well, they're just addicts and they're doing this because they're addicts, and that's kind of the what came first, the chicken or the egg, because are they using because of childhood trauma, like Kim mentioned, did their trafficker, quote, boo boyfriend, whatever, get them addicted? We look at that, and with gangs, we are seeing a turnover. And the thing about it is the city of Seattle, was really cracking down on buyers, and then the city of Portland was cracking down on buyers, and then Olympia's right in the middle, and they weren't doing anything. And so we've really, seen over the last couple of years a influx of gangs moving this way. And we are very low barrier services. So many of our clients are still, on Suboxone or in the life, and we are working with them towards, success, but it's really difficult. And they're talking about that, if they post an ad, they've got 4 or 5 pimps hitting them up, and kind of doing research on them that they're gang involved. And we need to make a difference. We really do. And yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Tika. The nuts and bolts to my job is jail intel, and that's how I started really realizing that there was such a connection between our criminal street gangs in Portland and how they were using trafficking as another hustle to make their money, because we all know that's the bottom line is money. I have not encountered one case, and we're looking at, we get plea deals, and probably the majority of the time now, because it's often the best way for our victims to get their justice, because they're not getting drug over the coals and grilled by defense, and we then know it's going to stick, right? So our tactics, our DA that focuses, J.R. Ujifisu, who's like amazing, has, he's been focusing on trafficking since about 2008. That was the year that I actually we wrote a federal JAG grant to collect and focus on trafficking. And I'd say 70 to 80% of our cases have a connection to our criminal street gangs in Portland.
Wow.
And so we're looking at, trying to remove these silos of as law enforcement sees it. You've got domestic violence, you've got trafficking, you've got gang affected families, you have sex crimes. All of those victims intersect often with all of those different silos. And if we're going to get anywhere, we need to be looking at that victim and how to best serve them and not fund these different silos. Like,
Yep.
That's part of this wraparound that we need to educate law enforcement all over the United States. My big thing that I love, and you talked about the I-5 corridor, is working with those law enforcement agencies, because these guys have cars. They send their girls anywhere that the money is going to be made. If the market's dry in Portland, Bellingham, Olympia, Seattle, California, Vegas, So we need to coordinate and continue to collaborate, like I said, as a system on a day-to-day basis. This is not like just a case to case. If we want to prevent, then we need to look at this no differently, and law enforcement, like we do with our criminal street gangs, in reporting these individuals that are on our radar for trafficking to WISN and RISNet, so that we can coordinate with other law enforcement agencies across the nation.
Could not agree more. Thank you. And we are running out of time, but really quick, Jeff, can you tell me about your passion? And then Debbie, can you tell me where your passion comes from?
I heard a speaker at a trafficking conference that I went to, quite honestly, because I needed the hours. I mean, I knew what human trafficking was, but I needed the hours for CEUs, for in-service training. And I heard a voice that said, you need to do this. And her story was incredibly compelling. Her problems with cops upset me greatly as a police officer in one of my worlds. And I thought, I got to do this. And I came home and told the warrior goddess, my beautiful wife, Debbie, and she said, let's do it. And the rest, as they say, is history. You tell me I'm wrong, Deb.
Not at all. That's exactly what he did. And when he brought that to light, and after I heard the speaker, it brought back just a flood of memories. I had family members who were involved in trafficking. My sister-in-law was involved in trafficking and had done some jail time for trafficking. But of course, back then they didn't call it trafficking. It was just good old prostitution, and so it really brought back all of the flood of memories of things that happened in my past. And when he said that, I was like, yes, we've got to. And we have been going at it ever since for about 7 years now.
Wow. We have a room of champions. We really do. And we're just getting about ready to go to Q&A. But I want to throw this out there, because a lot of times we hear about these horrific cases or, different things around trafficking. Can anybody tell me a story of resilience? I really want to hear your successes.
Well, I mean, I can give a story. One of the first cases that I served as an expert witness on was the pimp's name was Spider. His real name was James Joseph. One of the first times that he was ever arrested, his case was featured on America's Most Wanted and Investigation Discovery. So if you Google his name, those stories might come up. But in the first time that he was arrested, where he actually did physically kidnap and physically abuse his victims, beating one within an inch of her life, he only did and was sentenced to 18 months. 18 months was the punishment for this trafficker when he took a plea deal. And needless to say, again, because the risk was so low, he went back to doing it. His victims, they engaged in survival sex. They had, a really tough time to thriving afterwards, just because of the trauma they experienced and the lack of services. But it sounds like a negative story, but the benefit here is the second time he was caught in California in Contra Costa County, and the prosecutor there, Aaron DeFerrari, contacted me to serve as an expert witness. I testified to the grand jury for the indictment and at trial, and because of my testimony that helped, bridge this credibility gap of the victim, helped the jury understand how trafficking actually happens. This individual was sentenced to life in prison. So the first offense, 18 months, but life in prison. So he's not getting released. So I think that that's definitely a success story.
Sorry about the clapping. I thought I was on mute. But that is a success story.
Yeah.
Because jurors aren't experts. They don't get a training before the case starts. So there's a gap right there that needs to happen. Some legislation that needs to go through or something. Don't get me started.
I feel like I'm talking too much, but I have a success story that I think is amazing. My friend Robin and I were at an anti-trafficking auction, and we were sitting at a table with a woman who introduced herself, and she was an advocate at one of our a program here in Portland, and we got to talking, and she found out about the study I've been doing on trafficking tattoos, and she showed me her tattoo and said, you may know my trafficker. And I didn't know it by the tattoo, but when she said the name, I knew, and I had known that young man since he was about 8 years old. He had wrestled in my kids' wrestling club, and so I knew him personally. And I built a little bit of a relationship with her, and we started texting and talking. And she's an adult, and she had never had justice served from her exploiter. He had never done time for trafficking. And I said to her over a course of a week or so, that was done when you were a kiddo. Maybe we could talk to the DA and see if there's anything that can happen. And it was within the statute of limitations. So her exploitation happened with him when she was young in about 2006. And last year we indicted him. Actually, I think it was 2019. We indicted him on almost 70 counts of compelling, promoting, and various other crimes. And he just pled guilty about a month ago. He was in jail for the last year, and he's going to do about another 8 years. So to me, a success story and resiliency of a woman who continues to do good work despite negative things that happened to her in her past, and being strong enough to move forward later, knowing it's not too late, and knowing that by doing that, she probably has prevented other people from harm. And I just have a lot of respect for her. And, to me, I want to drill into people. We need to document, because they may not be ready when they're 15, 17, 19, 21, but maybe at 24, they're like, hell yeah, I'm ready. And if we have that documented, we can move back and indict people and move forward. I love that story, and she is still doing amazing work.
Well, we are talking about stories of resilience. Look at Tika. Look at me. Statistically, we shouldn't be here. We shouldn't. And to look at the stories of resilience of, not only people that are being advocates, but people that have came out of that, and I've also been doing this work long enough to see multi-generational exploitation, and I've also seen multi-generational resilience. People go back to school. We are all survivor staffed organization. We're all Indigenous, and I have seen survivors that I have worked with 15 years ago that still stay in contact, and one of them's a naturopath now. One of them just got their a paralegal degree. I mean, there's so many different success stories, but the problem with creating that really off-ramp to resiliency is lack of opportunities. And so we really, as champions, need to look at ways to build opportunities. Hire a survivor if you have contract work, if you're writing curriculum and really want it to be looked over from a survivor informed lens, that is a best practice. Continuing to have conversations like this. We are right at time. We didn't get any questions in the chat, but this could be 3 hours and we could still keep going. I really want us all to be thinking about a call to action. And Gabe is gonna say something. Be thinking of a call to action. I would love to be able to have a panel email go out so we can share each other's contact information to be able to continue to have these conversations, have a round two, and we could just grab our coffee and sit around and just have a really informative conversation. So thank you. And in Coast Salish tradition, even though I'm not Coast Salish, I do live on Coast Salish land, is to raise my hands, and this is a sign of respect to all of you. So I raised my hands to you all, and I am just deeply moved by your passion, and I feel a spark, and something's gonna happen. I do.